Good. We're online. And for those of you who are not in class, but you are watching this whenever, this is a sign of my stupidity that I didn't properly start the recording. So about 5 minutes was lost before somebody alerted me that this is not being recorded. And the class unanimously agreed that we're going to repeat that 5 minutes, more or less, in some speed, so that the people who are watching this are going to get the whole thing. All right. So the idea was this. You have already learned the analysis of the relationship between the price level and the output level, or the unemployment rate, because the output level implies some unemployment rate, right? That's your aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. What that is missing is something that we deeply care about, an analysis of inflation, right? Because in that setting, what you see is, well, here I see the output level, here I see the price level. Something happens, the price level changes. Let's say it goes up, okay? Fine. Now, that's inflation. The price level increasing, of course, is inflation. But when we think of inflation, we're thinking of this continuous process, right? Every year, on average, inflation in Turkey these days is like, whatever, 10%, okay? Well, that 10% annual average inflation is not in that framework, because all you've seen is a one-time jump in the price level, a one-time increase in inflation once, and then it stops. We're not talking about why is it that average inflation is high here but low there? What is the relationship between average inflation and other macroeconomic quantities? So those are things we're deeply interested in. We want to ask questions like, I want to lower the inflation rate, but for that, I have to have an understanding of that inflation rate. How do we get there? Seren Hanımcığım, do you have something to say? I see you on my screen, so if you have something to say, please write it in chat. All right, good. Now, the way this works is going to be looking at jointly, and that's the proper study of macroeconomics, the history of economic thought that brought us here and the economic history that led to that history of economic thought. Okay? We see something, we try to make sense of it, we theorize, and then we begin to fight on those theories, and those are important because those theories determine how we act, right? That's our understanding. And then the world changes, and we see something else. And then we say, ooh, I thought I understood. I thought things work this way, but it turns out this is possible because I see it in the world. And in my framework, that should not have been possible. So I must be missing something. Let me think again, okay? So here we're going to go back to 1950s and to Phillips, a New Zealander economist, who in 1958 published a paper that said, look, let me show you something interesting, okay? Let me show you the relationship between the wage inflation, that is the change in the average wage rates annually, and the unemployment rate for the past, essentially, 100 years, okay? So it's a graph that looks something like this. On the horizontal axis, you have the unemployment rate. On the vertical axis, you have the inflation rate, okay? And notice that with a sleight of hand, I went from wage inflation to inflation. Phillips's original paper was on the wage inflation rate, and people immediately said, yeah, wage inflation, inflation, more or less, they are the same. And I can think of theories where this applies to inflation, and I can see empirically that inflation behaves the same way too, okay? So most people wouldn't even know that the original empirical paper actually refers to wage inflation. We now think of this relationship, which we're going to call the Phillips curve, a relationship between inflation and unemployment, okay? But notice that currently we're talking about an empirical regularity. Phillips just said, look, data, okay? And the way data is presented is, for every year, he asked, what is the unemployment rate? What is the inflation rate, okay? And every year is at a point here, right? Unemployment rate is here, inflation rate is there, so I'm going to be here this year. And then he looks at the next year, and that next year is there, the next year is there, whatever, right? 1877, right here, 1942, I guess that's a wartime, so it's going to be a mess, right? But whatever, 1908 is going to be somewhere, I don't know where, but somewhere here, okay? So he took this, and it goes from something like 1860, mid-19th century, to 1950, mid-20th century. About 100 years of data, okay? And he said, look at that, okay? And your eye connects those dots, and when you don't do it with your eye, when you do it properly, it's called econometrics. And those of you who are economists, you're going to properly learn this, right? But it seems that in the years inflation was low, unemployment was high. In the years inflation was high, unemployment was low, or vice versa, right? In the years unemployment was low, inflation was high. Now, this is the essence of the Phillips paper, okay? It is an empirical paper that said, it seems that in the data, there is this relationship, okay? That relationship is what we call the Phillips curve, okay? It's the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and it seems to be an inverse relationship. Now, this alone doesn't tell us much, okay? It doesn't tell us whether this is a causal relationship or it clearly tells us there's a correlation, right? You know, for 100 years, it turns out in general, in the years unemployment was high, inflation was low, okay? That you see. However, we don't know whether it's high unemployment causing low inflation or low inflation causing high unemployment, or these two things being co-determined, or actually these are not related to each other, but they are related to something else that leads to this. Okay? And that's exactly where you need theory. Understanding comes from the theory, right? But this is what we have. All we have is a Phillips curve that is downward sloping. Then, within a decade, a whole bunch of giants of economics got interested in this. And the two of the most earliest contributors to the theory of why we might be seeing a Phillips curve in the data are someone you know, Bob Solow. You studied his contribution to growth, but you know, Allah uzun ömür versin, he is a giant and he has contributions in many areas, including this. And Paul Samuelson. In fact, they work together. Okay? Paul Samuelson, for a lot of practical purposes, is if not the father of economics as we study it today. You know, he has single-handedly almost founded the modern analysis of economics. And when teaching yesterday, I found my book in my bookshelf. So there you have it, Paul Samuelson, right? Samuelson and Solow said, well, we should be able to understand this from the perspective of the Keynesian theory that we are comfortable with, okay? So they took the aggregate supply, aggregate demand relationship that you studied in a subtler, more sophisticated, nicer form, but more or less that idea, and said, starting from that, I could actually make sense of this downward slope, okay? So here's the thing. So let's look at this. This is now aggregate demand, aggregate supply, right? So here I have output, here I have the price level, okay? And the question is, can I go from an analysis of output and the price level to an analysis of unemployment and the inflation rate? Now, going from output to unemployment doesn't require doing anything, because immediately I'm going to say, okay, I understand cyclical unemployment. So in the years output is high, unemployment will be low. And in the years output is low, unemployment will be high. Okay? So obviously there's an inverse relationship between output itself and the unemployment rate. These two I can change. The slope will change, right? Since these are inversely proportional, output and unemployment. But I don't need any deep theory of the relationship between unemployment and output. It's a different thing. Of course, I understand that it's changes in the price level that lead to inflation, but I need a theory of changes in the price level. Okay? So they said this. Let's look at the following. Here I have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay? And you've seen it a zillion times. Right? And I want to go to unemployment rate and inflation. Okay? This is the data. This is now going to be my theory. I'm going to ask, does my theory imply a Phillips curve of the sort that I see in the data? Right? So they said this. Now, think of the world where we're here, right? And we stay here. There is no Phillips curve. There is no inflation, or more properly, inflation is zero. There is some unemployment rate associated with this level of output. So I'm going to be at a point of this sort, right? This is zero inflation, some unemployment, whatever it is. And I'm just going to be there. There is no curve, though. Okay, just the point. But now think of the following. Think that in this country, every year, aggregate demand increases some. Why it increases, it could be many things, okay? For our purposes, we may want to think of the central bank doing this, because you've already seen how central bank policies, monetary policy, affects aggregate demand, right? And this is something you should remember. Monetary policy affects aggregate demand, right? Because monetary policy, even when affecting investment, is affecting investment demand. It's affecting people's desire to eat existing goods, people's desire to use existing goods to add to the capital stock. It's all demand. Monetary policy is demand management. Fiscal policy, by and large, is also demand management. When the government spending goes up, even if it's government's investment spending, right? The first thing that happens is somebody is saying, I want to use more of these things out there to do investment. Thus, it is demand that is going up, okay? And that is what makes economic policy not trivial. Because if we had control over supply, then, increased supply, output increases, price level falls. What is there to complain about, okay? The problem is, if I'm playing with demand only, when I increase demand, output increases, right? But prices also increase. I cause inflation, right? That gives me a trade-off. Now, we're going to study, and with opportunity, we're going to study in great detail for the remainder of the semester, whether this argument of, oh, yes, you just increase output, that works or not, right? But for the moment, let's think that the central bank is pursuing policies, some expansion of monetary stance. If you want to think of this as money supply, it increases money supply every year such that aggregate demand increases on average this much. If you want to think of this directly through interest rates, you can think that way. That is more consistent with how central banking is done these days, right? But on average, I expect to see aggregate demand increasing this much every year. Are we good so far? Cool. Okay. So when I ask these questions, I appreciate when you people chime in so that I know that wherever you are, something is happening to you as I talk. All right. And you know this, right? You have been living in this country for long enough. You understand that on average, inflation turns out to be 3%. You don't really have to understand how this relates to monetary policy, how this relates to fiscal policy, how this relates to productivity changes, population change, demographics, whatever. Okay? All you know is, in my world, inflation is about 3%. You've seen this enough to know that inflation is about 3%. Okay? So when you're signing your contracts for next year, you're going to think that inflation will be something like 3%. When you're setting your prices, when you're printing your menus for your goods, right, you're going to take into account that inflation is going to be about 3%. And this signing your contracts, setting your wages, printing your menus, setting your prices, these are all the Keynesian ideas, where the thinking is there is some nominal stickiness. Stickiness is an important word. It says these markets don't work perfectly in the sense of prices being reset every period, okay? Prices change infrequently, and there is a great literature, again, those of you who are economists are going to learn quite a lot of it, on why that might be the case. But the thinking is going to be that there are some prices that do not change immediately. When something happens and prices can't change, then quantities will have to change. That's what gives the business cycles in the Keynesian framework. Okay? Well, we'll come back to this. Now, although, allow me to repeat this. Okay? This is something that is lost on a lot of people, including some economists. The main thing that makes the Keynesian idea, the standard Keynesian idea, or what is now called the new Keynesian micro-founded idea, tick, is the fact that the world effectively works the following way. The firms, the suppliers, the supply side, posts a price. They announce, I'm going to sell my goods, or I'm going to sell my labor, I'm going to sell my services, whatever, okay, at this price. Once they say it, they have to fulfill demand at that price until they can change that price again. The quantity is then chosen by the demand side, okay? So I tell you, I'm going to teach you, 1 hour of macro for 8 liras an hour, and then you tell me, okay, we want to learn 50 hours of macro. And I was like, okay, that's what I expected. That's good. But let's say inflation turns out to be very high. 8 liras is a pittance, right? And you say, oh, this macro class is cheap. So we're going to buy, 200 hours of macro classes. Now, I might think, I didn't want to teach 200 of macro classes for 8 liras an hour, especially given that 8 liras doesn't buy much anymore, okay? But I have to, because I posted that price and you bought those quantities at that price, okay? That's the Keynesian idea. Now, here, we think that demand is going to increase to this level, and we have a desired output level. So we ask, all right, at what price do I want to produce my goods? At what price do I want to announce? What wage rate am I going to choose? And the firm and the employee sign this contract. In the Keynesian idea, or the Keynes-Hicks Keynesian framework, it is really the rigidity of the wage rate that leads to these dynamics, okay? At the beginning of the year, the firm and the employee sit down together and sign a contract that says your wage is going to be this per hour. Okay? Once that contract is signed, the firm then chooses, and therefore you're going to work this many hours. Now, in our mind, we're thinking that demand will be here, so we choose the prices such that supply will be here, and I'm producing the same amount at a different price. Okay? The only thing that changed is price is higher. But nothing real has changed. Okay? My world is the same world. One Econ class takes the same preparation and the same amount of time to teach. One car takes the same effort and same material to produce. Real things haven't changed. The only thing that's going to change when demand increases is going to be prices increasing, if we know exactly what is going to happen to demand, okay? So we're here now. And now let's say, this is where you're going to understand the underpinnings of the Phillips curve. Let's assume this happens every year, okay? Every year, demand goes up by 3%. Every year, we know, I'm going to say this correctly. Every year, demand goes up by an amount that is consistent with 3% inflation. Every year, we understand this, and therefore change our prices that is consistent with 3% inflation. And therefore, every year, there is 3% inflation and nothing else happens. Okay? So what's happening here? Every year, demand does this, supply does that, demand does this, supply does that, right? I'm moving this way. So what's happening to, now this is a question to you, okay? Well, over time, right? I started this, let's say this is period 0, period 1, period 2, period 3, okay? What is happening to the output level as time progresses? That's right, exactly. Thank you. Yes, output doesn't change, okay? If output isn't changing, what is happening to the unemployment rate? Yeah, that stays the same too, right? At the back of our minds, we think that population isn't changing, labor force participation isn't changing, demographics aren't changing, all that, right? So whatever unemployment is at this output level, it remains the same, okay? So I have some unemployment rate, but what is happening to the price level? Is the price level staying the same as well? Yeah, the price level is increasing, and there is a name for that. It is called, that is right, very good. You learned something, right? Yes, so there's inflation, okay? So there's 3% inflation. So what do I see? There's going to be some unemployment rate, okay, here, and some inflation rate here. And we're going to be at a point like this, okay? Now notice that I still don't have, I didn't manage to put the point in the right place, like this, okay? And notice that I don't still have a Phillips curve of any sort. I just have some inflation rate, some unemployment rate, and I'm always here, okay? No curve. This is where we get to the curve. Now assume that demand increases in a way that is consistent with 3% inflation every year on average, but not exactly that, okay? The thing about Phillips curve is there are a lot of curves to consider to understand this, okay? Because these are curves relating levels to each other. They have to be moving around so that I'm going to have a curve of changes, okay? So it gets ugly. It doesn't get difficult. It just gets ugly, all right? So let me erase this and do this again. Think that I'm starting here again, all right? And I think that demand is going to increase this much. This is what is consistent with 3% inflation. So I set my prices to be here, okay? But demand doesn't increase exactly that much. You could think of a million reasons, okay? You know, it could be that the central bank doesn't have exact control over demand, which is correct, right? The central bank doesn't have exact control over monetary aggregates, which is also correct. The central bank increases the monetary base, thinking that, okay, I'm going to increase base money this much, or I'm going to set the short-term interest rate at this level, okay? And that's going to take money M2, the broader, more relevant monetary aggregate, to this level. But the money multiplier works differently this year. Could happen, right? Or you set your short rate, and the long rate doesn't exactly change the way you thought it would. Or, you know, let's take this one, right? We were here, we thought we'd be here, and then suddenly, Gençler Birliği wins the league, okay? We're all elated. We're so happy, we all go out, you know, party, eat, drink, make merry, demand goes up. It's wonderful for the country that Gençler Birliği has won, right? So demand doesn't take place here. It turns out to be here, all right? And let me exaggerate this a little bit so that you can see what happens, right? Because, again, remember, we were just going 3%, 3%, 3%, and then we expected 3% again, but demand increased all the way to here, for example, right? So rather than going to this point, because I had already set my prices, aggregate supply, the aggregate supply curve is here, okay? I set the prices and I said, at this price, I'm going to produce this quantity. At that price, I'm going to produce that quantity. This is where aggregate supply is, okay? And equilibrium is now here, okay? First I ask, what happened to inflation? No, let me ask a better question. Let me do this in sequence, okay? What happened to the price level? The price level increased. Very good. Yeah, that's obvious, right? Now I could ask though, this was on average 3% inflation country. This would have been 3% inflation, right? But the increase is this much. So now I can ask, what happened to inflation? Is this the usual inflation in this country? Is it 3%? Okay, no is correct, more or less. Has inflation increased or inflation decreased? Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now I see that inflation has increased. Demand increased more than anticipated. Okay. We're all surprised. Notice that we are all surprised, right? None of us thought Gençler Birliği could win the champions anytime. Okay. So when they won, we were surprised. And we said, ha, we understand, of course, it's Gençler Birliği winning, increasing the demand. Okay. But this comes as a surprise, and we don't feel badly, because remember this, I could ask myself, okay, I posted my price for an hour of 1 or 2 lectures. Okay, was I stupid to post 8 liras an hour? And I can safely say, well, knowing what I knew then, that was the right price. I could not have guessed that Gençler Birliği would win. People will go crazy, there will be partying everywhere, right? And demand will increase so much that inflation will go up more than 3%. Okay? Exposed, I understand why this happened. I don't even have to. It's just that, you know, for next year, do I expect Gençler Birliği to win again? It was probably a once-in-a-lifetime event. Okay? And I'm going to expect 3% inflation again. This year was special. Okay? But notice what happened. Inflation went up. Okay? What happened to output? Is output at the same level? Output also increased, right? You see that if inflation were at 3%, output would be unchanged. But when demand increased, okay, I moved along this aggregate supply curve, and output increased too, this much, okay, between this output level and that. But if output increased, what happened to the unemployment rate? Yeah, that's right. Very good. I seem to be getting answers from the same people, and I'll appreciate if you chime in more. But let me repeat what you told me, right? Price level increased more than usual. Therefore, inflation increased, and the unemployment rate decreased. Thus, I now have a point where inflation is higher, I moved up, and the unemployment rate is lower, I moved sideways here. This is another point. Okay. Now let's think of the year after that. Okay. So once again, and I'm going to normalize my output to its usual level again. Let's say I was here. Okay. I expected demand to increase 3% again, to be here. I set my prices, and I'm going to be here. And this year, it turns out to be a sucky year. Okay. Why might it be a sucky year? Why might demand be so low? In the spring of 2020, you should really be able to answer that question. You know, tell me a reason why aggregate demand might be falling. Yeah, there you go, right? So, for example, this is actually, of course, I prompted you for this answer, but the pandemic has a lot of effects on aggregate supply as well. Firms are shut down, okay? Let's ignore this and say, you know, people were ordered not to leave their homes. And in fact, they understood that it's good for their life expectancy that they don't leave home, okay? So demand falls, but we had set supply already, okay? Notice that here what's happening isn't that demand is increasing less than before. Demand is actually falling, right? So I'm gonna be at a point like this, okay? So here I have a, what do I have? What happens to prices? The prices decreased, that has a term, right? Prices decreased, yes, yes. I see that you see, yes, there is deflation, okay? Now I have deflation. it's not only inflation falling, it's the price level itself falling, okay? What is happening to the output though? I was here in terms of output, now I'm here. What happened to output? Yep, exactly. And what happened to the unemployment rate? Yeah. So I'm going to be at a point like this, okay? Negative inflation, I'm going to choose 0, right? And very high unemployment rate. So now I'm here, and it can happen, right? Negative inflation is, there's deflation, there's a term for it. It can happen. And now, several things. One, remember that at the very beginning of the semester, this should be the first week or so, when we were talking about inflation, disinflation, deflation, whatnot, I told you that you're Turkish, you've never seen, you're not all Turkish actually, there's a lot of international students in this class, but those of you who are Turkish have never seen negative inflation on a prolonged basis. Sometimes in summer, in July, August, we have monthly decreases in the price level because the produce prices fall. But on an annual basis, you've never seen deflation, okay? And it's difficult to explain to a Turkish person why falling prices might be a bad thing, okay? This is exactly where you have to think. What else is happening as prices are falling? Why are prices falling, okay? Because nothing else is changing, prices are falling, nothing to complain about, okay? But usually we think that this is why prices would be falling. Something terrible has happened, nobody is buying anything, that is why prices are falling, but that means we're not producing anything either. Incomes are lower, and unemployment rates go through the roof. This is why, one of the several reasons why people fear deflation, okay? Another one has to do with debt dynamics, which we're not going to get into in this class. But you could immediately understand from your basic training in interest rates, nominal interest rates, real interest rates, and how inflation relates to those, right? If I expected 3% inflation, took a loan so that I'm going to build a factory, whatever, okay? And inflation turned out to be minus 2%, okay? It's a 5% change in the real interest rate that I'm paying. It's killing me that suddenly there is this unexpected deflation, okay? And usually that kind of deflation hurts the borrowers. And if your borrowers are your firms who are borrowing to do investment, then they go bankrupt, they stop doing investment, blah, 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 not good things going forward either, okay? So we've learned to fear deflation. But notice what is happening here now, okay? Now you've seen all kinds of examples, and now you understand that different combinations of these are possible, right? Every year, I expect 3% inflation. I expect demand to be somewhere here. And this is correct, right? Because I could not have guessed that demand was going to increase this way. I could not have guessed that demand was going to decrease this way, all right? And we're going to talk about these guesses, these expectations in a few minutes. So I expect demand to be here, I set supply here, and then demand turns out to be here. What happened? Lower inflation, right? The prices didn't go up as much, but output is lower too, so unemployment went up. So I'm going to be at a point like this, okay? And then another year, demand turns out to be here, so that prices go up more, output goes up as well, and unemployment rate falls, and I'm going to be at a point like this. And now you see the relationship. Did we get the Phillips curve from our theory? It is a question that requires an answer for me to continue. Okay, so I understand that. Yes, we did. Yes. Very good, right? Because in the data, we saw, Phillips saw and showed us that there is an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation rates, okay? Now I took my theory and asked, does my theory imply that kind of a relationship? And the answer turns out to be yes. Yes, in a world where there are demand shocks, and so there is an average increase in demand, okay? And that average is on average the average, but every single year it's not exactly that. It's sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower. Okay, in a world with nominal stickiness, prices set in advance, I will end up with something that resembles a Phillips curve. Okay, very good. Now, we're going to give a break of 2 minutes. That's enough for you to get a cup of tea or wash your face, whatever, and then we'll be back actually in 2 minutes. And I'm going to pause this relationship, but I will be here. If you have questions, if you want to chat, whatever, I'll be here. Cool. Okay. Welcome back. Now we have a Phillips curve. Okay, and this is where the history of economic thought and economic history is going to get interesting. Okay, there is some debate about this. The school of thought says, here's what happened. In the 1960s, Solow, Samuelson, others, they figured this out. Okay, now this is a causal relationship that goes from demand to unemployment and inflation. Okay, and it says you're going to have, this is an important word for economists, a trade-off between unemployment and inflation rates. Then policymakers looked at this and said, good to know. We are now at a point, let's say, like this, right? And you know what? As a policymaker, I have preferences over inflation and unemployment. I dislike unemployment more than I dislike inflation. That is, that trade-off doesn't seem too bad for me. And I would rather be at a point like this, lower unemployment, higher inflation. I am willing to take a little higher inflation to lower unemployment a bit more. And you are telling me that I can do this by increasing demand more. Okay? Now let's see what happens if we do that. I start out here again, right? And you think that inflation will be 3%, demand will be here. You set your prices, wages, whatever, so that this is a good supply, okay? And I increase demand more, I take it here, so that the inflation is higher, right? And output is also higher, and therefore unemployment is lower, so I actually move from here to there. Okay? Was my policy successful? Yeah, very good. So you see that, okay? Cool, all right. So now, next year comes, right? You know that you're living in 3% inflation world, right? This is the 3% inflation country. And every now and then, it turns out to be 2.5%, 3.5%, rarely 4, but it has happened, and it happened last year too. And you're like, shit, who would have thought? Inflation turned out to be 4%, or whatever, right? For next year, you're gonna expect 3% inflation again, set your prices accordingly, right? Supply will be here, but the central bank will increase demand such that inflation will be 4%, assuming these are the same level, right? Output is higher, so I remain at this point, right? Output is still higher, therefore unemployment is still lower. To do so, I gave you 4% inflation, so inflation is higher here too. Then you said, shit. Again, I thought it would be 3%, turned out to be 4%. Who would have thought? Okay? And then next year, you say, well, this is 2%, 3% inflation country, so I'm going to sign my contracts, set my prices, print my menus based on 3% inflation. Supply will be here, and the central bank is going to increase demand more, and you're going to have 4% inflation. You remain at this point. Okay? Now, here's the question. How long does it take for you to catch on that this is no longer 3% inflation country? Think of yourselves, right? How many years of not about 3%, but about 4% inflation would you have to see to say, ooh, apparently inflation on average is no longer 3%, but 4%. If you're Turkish, you would do this very quickly. Okay, in Turkey, expectations change very quickly because we have unanchored inflation and inflation expectations. But think that you came from a decade of about 3% inflation, right? You wouldn't change your expectation in a year, maybe not in 2 years, but in the third year you'll say, 3 years in a row of 4% inflation. This hasn't happened before. Okay, in the fourth year you're going to say this really seems improbable. In the fifth year you're going to say, screw it. Average inflation apparently isn't 3%. Okay, there is no specific time period, right? Now, this is where we get into the all-important analysis of expectations. Now we understand that this whole thing actually depended on you expecting 3% inflation. That is what set the supply schedule. But if you're no longer expecting 3%, here's what's going to happen. Let's say I start here again, okay? And this is the year where we all said, no, inflation will be 4%. Now I figured it out, okay? Some of us actually understand. Some of us look at the central bank and say, these people's setting off, these men's, if you're in Turkey, you're going to say they are all men in Turkey, right? The central bank is setting interest rates in such a way that creates more inflation. They are doing this on purpose, okay? They are trying to increase demand. So inflation will be 4%, right? Some others are going to say, I just keep on seeing 4% inflation, and I think average inflation is 4% for reasons I don't understand. But notice that I didn't understand why it was 3% to begin with. So I just, see the history, and eventually I say, okay, apparently it's now the 4% world. Okay? We'll talk about this in a minute. But look what happens. Rather than increasing my prices in a way that is consistent with 3%, I increase them in a way that is consistent with 4% inflation, right? Because, in Turkey, the workers don't have bargaining power. Nonetheless, you see that when there are wage negotiations, wages go up by 6%, 8%, 10%. And this is the case these days, okay? In the past few years, let me say, because the pandemic is going to change that too. But when you look at the German wage negotiations, right, the wage increases are 0, 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%. Why? Low inflation there, high inflation here, okay? So going forward, wages change in a way that is kind of consistent with inflation. When I set my prices, I do similarly. So what happens? Now the supply schedule is here. The central bank says, okay, my brilliant plan of increasing demand in a way consistent with 4% inflation, increasing demand more than before, and lowering unemployment was working beautifully. Let me do it again, right? So the central bank increases demand, and here's what happens. What happened to output? Output doesn't change, right? Yes, exactly. Output stays the same. But what happened to inflation? Is inflation back to 3%? That's right. Inflation is high, but output hasn't changed, okay? So now let's ask, we were here, right? The central bank new policy had brought us here. Now, call this direction A and call this direction B. In which direction am I moving now? Any other takers? All right, this is where I turn to you and say, idiots. Every time you fall for this, and you are, big boys, girls, others now, okay? Use your brains. It's a good exercise, right? Look, the unemployment rate is consistent with this, right? That's where I started from. This was the unemployment rate for my normal output. So I'm going to be here in terms of unemployment. but inflation hasn't fallen back. So I'm going to be at a point like this. I am not going to move on this curve. The curve will shift. And by this time, you really should understand how to do this kind of analysis, okay? It is true, the Turkish education system fails you altogether. But we've been through this multiple times this semester already, right? Remember this. A graph is a representation of a relationship in space. This is a two-dimensional space. This is the unemployment inflation space. And I'm looking at the relationship between unemployment and inflation in this space. That line tells me that, look, if you tell me unemployment has changed, I can tell you what happened to inflation. If you tell me inflation has changed, I can tell you what happened to unemployment, okay? But what is it that I changed? I changed inflation expectations. It's not on these axes. When inflation expectations change, the relationship between inflation and unemployment itself changes. The relationship is the line. When the line changes, this line is moving around, okay? So what happens? I'm going to have the old unemployment rate with the new inflation rate. Are we good? Are you sure? You told me you understood this multiple times before when we're talking about when you move along an aggregate expenditure line, when the line itself moves around, when you move along an IS curve, when the line itself moves around, okay? But by this time, it is really time that you get this. Now, where's my chalk? Cool. Now, this is where the following may happen. And in fact, if you look at the data, it may actually have happened. There is debate on this, okay? The central bank says, this time the central bank says, shit, didn't see that coming, right? I did generate 4% inflation, but unemployment rate isn't lower, okay? What would I do? Well, how about 5% inflation? Now you expect 4% inflation, so that aggregate supply is here, and then the central bank creates 5% inflation, and I'm here. What happens now? What happens to the inflation rate? Goes up already. What happens to the unemployment rate? Yeah, the unemployment rate goes down. So now I'm going to be at a point like this, okay? This is my new Phillips curve. And now I understand, right? There is a different Phillips curve for every expected inflation level. This was the expected inflation 3% Phillips curve. This is the expected inflation 4% Phillips curve. Once you are expecting 4% inflation, if I generate more inflation than that, if I increase demand more than consistent with 4% inflation, you're going to move on this curve and unemployment rate will fall, inflation will go up. Okay, cool. So now I'm giving you 5%, but of course, very soon you're going to catch on. You're going to say, shit, inflation is 5% now. Can I give you 6, maybe, or 7? Sure. But now you see what is happening, right? The inflation rate is going to go haywire. And the unemployment rate is going to be somewhere here, okay? In the US, in the 1970s, in fact, towards the end of 1970s, inflation had reached 12%, okay? And by their standards, that's very high. Now, in between, the following was happening. Ned Phelps, who won a Nobel Prize for this, Samuelson also very likely won one of the first Nobel Prizes in economics. Solow, you already know, has won, okay? So Phelps has won because Phelps came and said the following. Okay, so I see your analysis of the Phillips curve and I understand how you relate to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and it looks something like this, these curves moving around. But when I draw this, when I draw the aggregate supply, aggregate demand relationship, it doesn't have 2 curves, it has 3. What am I missing here? This is what you studied with Burçin Hoca, right? There is aggregate supply, exactly, right? We understand that there is a long-run aggregate supply that is vertical. This is where we talk about some of the most important and interesting topics in macro, okay? We said the reason aggregate supply is upward sloping is because prices are sticky. Firms can't immediately change their prices, so they have to change quantities, okay? But prices aren't sticky forever. All prices eventually change. And when prices change and all markets get to their flexible price equilibrium, okay? Whatever the price level is, I'm going to be at some output level, Y star. And what defines Y star is our Solowian understanding of productive capacity. This is where we get to the topic of potential income, potential output, potential gross domestic product, the same thing. You talked about this with Burçin Hoca. I would like for you to hear this from me once again, okay? This is something that is really deeply important. First, remember the following, or learn the following. The way we use the word potential in daily life is different from its technical, terminological usage in economics, okay? In daily life, we often use potential to mean the maximum. In macroeconomics, we use potential to mean normal. Here's the difference. My favorite example. Let's say I am, this is factually correct, a Bilkent economics graduate, well-trained, right? I speak English. I could do a lot, okay? Let's also say I'm very lazy. You just can't get me to do anything. So I don't work much. I have low income, kind of miserable, and that's life, okay? Now, Tezes would say, oh, that man has so much potential, okay? Tezes, who are economists, will say, he's exactly at his potential because given his laziness, since laziness is part of him, okay, it is normal for him that he's not doing much and he's miserable. Do you understand the difference? Okay, now, when you map this to macroeconomics, the idea is this. For example, do we expect to see everyone in the labor market, in the labor force, to be employed? Or do we expect to see some people to be unemployed? I am repeating. We do expect some people to be unemployed, okay? That is, some unemployment is normal. What kind of unemployment is normal? We studied this together, you remember that. Frictional unemployment is normal, right? When you graduate, because you're dumb, you're going to begin to look for a job after you graduate, most of you, okay? And of course you're going to find jobs because there are jobs looking for you, but it's going to take a couple of months for you to find a job. And in those couple of months, you will be unemployed. That's frictional unemployment, okay? So don't be dumb. Look for a job before you graduate. Anyhow, notice that when you're looking for a job before you graduate, you will still be unemployed, right? Because you are of working age, you will be looking for a job, you will not have a job, you will be technically unemployed, right? Fine. And then, very true. Also, people who are structurally unemployed, we understand why they are employed, okay? Someone structurally unemployed, it's normal for that person to be unemployed. It's in the definition of structural unemployment. That person doesn't have the skills to find employment, right? Immediately it says, normal unemployment in Turkey has to be high, right? Because the Turkish education system sucks and it creates all these unskilled people, but the labor market demands some skills and these people become structurally unemployed, okay? So is it normal that the unemployment rate is going to be 8% in Turkey, for example? I want an answer. Okay, so somebody very securely said, yes, it is normal. I don't know, okay? It's not easy because when you look at someone, it's not easy to label people, she is frictional unemployed, he is structural unemployed, she is cyclically unemployed. Those are not easy things, okay? But yes, statistically, although we can't exactly say, we understand, given the mismatch between how the world is working now and what the Turkish education system is inflicting on you, right? There's a lot of structurally unemployed people in Turkey, and therefore normal unemployment is high in Turkey. So, you know, when we see 8% unemployment, we think that, oh, we're doing good in terms of unemployment. And notice that we haven't seen 8% in quite a while, okay? But when in Germany, unemployment goes above 5%, they begin to go, oh, this is shitty, okay? Japan is different. Japan has low structural unemployment and very low frictional unemployment too. We talked about this earlier, right? So when they see 3%, 4%, they go, oh, this is high. So every system has its own normal. What is tricky here is when I say normal, you have a very good sense of what normal means. When I say, okay, measure normal, you wouldn't know how to do it. This is the problem with potential GDP. Potential GDP is the output created in a country, in an economy, when factors of production are normally utilized. Utilization is a nice word. We measure this some way. We do surveys, right? Firms get asked, what percentage of your capacity are you using? Türkiye'de bu kapasite kullanım oranı diye geçer. Okay? And the answer is never 100%, right? Because some firms are always, you know, they're lacking demand, that's why they're not producing. Or part of the factory is undergoing renovations, or they are installing new machinery, whatever, okay? So that number, the capacity utilization rate, is usually something like maybe 85%, okay? But sometimes it falls all the way down to 70. Now, if your normal is 85%, when I see 85, I say, fine, this is what is supposed to be in this world, right? I don't expect to see 100% anyway. Now, can I go above normal? Can I produce more than potential GDP? Sure, right? You know, what is normal for you is you study, 10 hours for the macro exam. Could you study 15 hours? Of course you can. You wouldn't in general, but you can, okay? That's the difference between normal and maximum. Potential isn't maximum in this sense. Factories work in 2 shifts. Could they work in 3 shifts? Yes. Could they work in 3 shifts forever? No, because clearly it's not normal, okay? Something's got to give. What's going to happen? Wages are going to go up so much that factory owners are going to say it's not worth running these factories in 3 shifts at these wages, okay? But do understand that potential GDP is one of the most important concepts in macroeconomics. It gives us a great tool to think about the world we're living in, but it's very difficult to measure. There's a lot of econometrics that tries to get these latent, what are called underlying variables, okay? But here's what happens. I understand that in the long run, once oil prices adjust, I will get to my normal and I will produce at my normal. This could be at any price level. This is why long-run aggregate supply is vertical, right? The long-run aggregate supply is vertical at the potential. It defines the potential. I could be producing my potential at a low price level, at a high price level, whatever. That doesn't matter, okay? Now, the contribution Phillips brought was, he said, you people are working with this Phillips curve and talking about, so this is the Phillips curve, right? And talking about the unemployment inflation trade-off or the output inflation trade-off. Okay? However, I understand that long-run aggregate supply is vertical. Thus, in the long run, I will be at this output level. And at this output level, I will be at some associated unemployment level. Let's say this one, okay? This is U star. But notice that it doesn't depend on what the rate of, what the price level is, or what the average inflation rate is. Whatever the inflation rate, in the long run, I will be at potential, and therefore this unemployment level. Thus, in the long run, there is no relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. There is a long-run Phillips curve as well. This won Phelps the Nobel Prize because this underlies the idea that, okay, in the short run, perhaps you can trade off inflation and unemployment, but if you push this, in the end, you'll have to come back here because this is your natural rate. And now you understand why it's called the natural. Sometimes it's called the NEIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay, the rate of unemployment such that inflation will be stationary here. Because if you go here, then inflation will be higher than normal. This is a weird use of normal. We'll not use that. Inflation will go up, but then inflation expectations will eventually change. So my Phillips curve is going to shift, and I'm going to get here, and I will end up with higher inflation. Okay, why? Because I changed the unemployment rate from its normal, the non-accelerating rate, and inflation did accelerate. Okay, but his point was eventually this curve will shift such that, right, whatever expected inflation is, on that Phillips curve, I will be at this unemployment rate. There is no long-run trade-off. Okay, this is something you'll have to think of a little bit, and you're going to repeat these with Burçin Hoca in more detail next week. But I do want you to understand the following. This gives us a great tool to do policy with, okay? Assume that you are Turkey, right? Now, immediately you can understand why the government, the palace, is pressuring the central bank to lower interest rates so much, right? Because they want demand to do this so that without having to increase the productive capacity, without really adding to human capital, without really changing female labor force participation, without really making an environment in the country that is amenable for investment and increasing capital stock. Given what we have now, demand will increase a lot. Okay, sure, it's going to create more inflation, but the unemployment rate will fall. And at an election time, actually, low unemployment counts for more than high inflation. Okay, but you do this once, twice, 3 times. The central bank's webpage, you're going to find the surveys of inflation expectations, and you will see that over the past few years, they have been drifting up. Why? Actual inflation is going up. People like me, and now people like you, understand the mechanism, okay? The government is increasing its own spending. You can see this in the budget numbers. They are not collecting taxes. You can see that too. They're pressuring the central bank to cut interest rates, increase money supply. That is happening. And in general, there is expansionary policies every which way. But this comes back to the point that we talked about earlier. Expansionary policies are demand management. You're expanding aggregate demand, but you have a capacity constraint. This is what is normal for this economy. When you begin to push demand up, you can get an expansion of output. And this did happen in 1990, 2013, 14, 15. This did happen, okay? But afterwards, what you see is slowly, this time, inflation begins to go up, and you begin to lose what you gained in employment terms. You begin to move your Phillips curve altogether. Expected inflation goes up, okay? So that's the world we're living in now. Now comes the following question. Okay, we did some really bad policies, okay? And so the Turkish Phillips curve is way up here. And although I talk about these Phillips curves, and this is something that is in my toolkit, and I use this in my own analysis, there's a lot of debate currently ongoing on, whether this Phillips curve is a stable thing, whether it breaks down, what its slope is around the world, okay? And you will see bits and pieces of this debate as we move forward. But to my mind, we are at a point like this, okay? Or we are on a Phillips curve like this, and this is, let's say, expected inflation about 10% Phillips curve, okay? That means if you end up having 10% inflation, your unemployment rate will still be here at its normal place, and you will be stuck with high inflation, which we are stuck, okay? Now, what can you do? What are your policy options? Okay? This is where another Nobel Prize winner, Robert Lucas Jr., comes in, called Bob Lucas. Bob Lucas said, okay, you model these people, these model economy agents, as looking at past inflation and assuming that future inflation will be like the past. Okay? These are called adaptive expectations. That is, when you ask me, who's going to win the Turkish league, okay, I answer, well, Galatasaray, Fenerbahçe, or Beşiktaş. Why? Because only they have won in the past umpteen years. Okay? Now assume suddenly, actually, Gençler Birliği gets its act together and has this great team. Okay? You people are all great football analysts, and you see that, this is the greatest football team ever put together in the history of the world. Okay? So you come to me and ask, who's going to win the league? And I say, one of Galatasaray, Beşiktaş, or Fenerbahçe, because they always win. Okay? This is adaptive expectations. I look back. The world has changed. I don't realize. Okay? Bob Lucas said, people don't really have adaptive expectations of this sort. Rather, they have rational expectations. Rational expectations in economics is not a value judgment. I don't call it rational when I like your expectation, and I don't call it irrational when I dislike it. Okay? Rational expectations actually means, look, statistics is properly a subfield of mathematics. And given any distribution of possibilities, there is a correct, and I'm going to define correct in a second, there is a correct expectation, correct in the sense of minimizing forecast errors. Okay? That is, for example, I could have answered Trabzonspor 2, right? Who's going to win the league? Because you know the distribution. Trabzonspor has won. I could have answered Bursaspor 2 because Bursaspor has won. Okay? But I will never answer Gençler Birliği because Gençler Birliği has never won. All right? I'm going to put weights on these different outcomes. Think of inflation, for example. In Turkey, can inflation be 2%? Okay? It's not impossible. But if somebody comes and says it's going to be 2%, you're going to ask, what are you smoking? Okay? As a mean expectation, that just doesn't work. If you tell me 9%, we can debate. If you tell me 22%, right, we can debate because we had 22% like 2 years ago. Okay? The upside is there. Rational expectations says, think of the mathematical expectation. Okay? This is the mathematical expectations operator. If for any variable x, your expectation, your subjective expectation of x is the mathematical expectation of x, and you're going to study these in your statistics course next year, okay? I call you as having rational expectations. This is the definition, okay? Now notice that this is contingent on an information set. It depends on what you know, right? So I could come to you and say, what is your expected inflation? And you tell me 9%. And then I can come to you and say, you know what? Here is the central bank's balance sheet. The central bank is increasing money supply like crazy, like never seen in history, okay? If I say this to you, then you're going to say, okay, we have never seen this, but now I expect 1,000% inflation, okay? With adaptive expectations, you're never going to get that because you've never seen it. With rational expectations, now you're using your understanding of the world you're living in, and you're using your understanding of what we call the data generating process to form your expectations. Here is why it's important. I have a central bank. I know that the government is pushing the central bank to pursue expansionary monetary policy. Okay? Now, on a weekend, I hear that the central bank governor is fired and somebody else is put in place. Okay? I don't know why the central bank governor is fired much, right? And I don't know the person who has been put in place. I've never heard of that person. Nonetheless, do I think, why would the government have done this and what the repercussions of that will be? Will the central bank be even more expansionary now? Do you think in these lines? We're at the end of the class. We're almost done, but I do need your answers to proceed. Okay, cool, right? You do. You understand that, the central bank governor is changed because he's not doing what the government wants it to do, although the policy was terrible anyway. Okay? So probably they put in someone, you don't know this is why they probably, right? But probably they brought in someone who will do exactly what they say. And therefore, policy is going to be even more expansionary. Do I expect more inflation now? What happens to the Phillips curve? Do I move on the Phillips curve or does the Phillips curve shift? It does shift, right? The Phillips curve goes up. This is exactly where all this talk about central bank credibility, central bank communication, central bank transparency comes into play. This is what you're going to do with Gürkaynak, but let's give you a 1 minute sweet summary of this. Okay? Let's say we're here, and this sucks. We want to lower inflation. Here's one way of doing this. I cut back on my expansionary policies. I actually pursue contractionary policies. Demand, rather than increasing, decreases. You didn't expect this. I was on this Phillips curve. What happens? Inflation falls, but unemployment goes through the roof, right? There's a huge disinflating cost, okay? This is called the sacrifice ratio. How much unemployment do you have to create to lower inflation, okay? And the flatter your Phillips curve is, the more unemployment you will have to create. Now, this is terrible. I don't want to do this. Since you know that I don't want to do this, I won't do it. You expect high inflation. We are in an equilibrium. We are here, okay? To break that, I may have to create a recession, lower demand, increase unemployment, so that you see, oh, okay, we have a serious central bank and inflation will be falling. So I'm going to expect lower inflation. So we're going to be at this Phillips curve, that Phillips curve. But wouldn't it be better if I could come to you and say, look, I tell you wholeheartedly with, swearing on everything that is important to me, inflation will fall. Please don't expect 10% inflation, but plan your lives, choose your prices, whatever, that is consistent with 5% inflation. How about that? If you believed me, then we would immediately shift from here to here, 5%, say this is 5%, right? 5%. And the sacrifice ratio is 0. I did not have to change unemployment at all to get inflation to be 5%. Okay? But that's the communication and the transparency. I explained to you, look, the new central bank of Turkey is a serious central bank. We actually care about the law, and the law says my job is to have stable prices, low inflation. Okay, so we will do this. And, I promise that I'm going to resign if within 2 years inflation isn't at the target. All right? If I could convince you of this, convincing means I am credible, then I can have fairly costless disinflations. This is why central banks go crazy about trying to explain themselves and to have this credibility. And this is why it's so sad that our central bank, which was one of the best in the world, is in such incredible, sad situation, okay? Because it pushed us up here, all right? But these are the institutional matters that affect your policymaking ability. Because could I do this, for example? I convince you that it's going to be 5%. So the Phillips curve is here. And then I say, let's not go to 5. Let's go to 7. Because then we'll be here. Inflation will have fallen from 10 to 7. So I will say, inflation is falling, I told you. And unemployment rate will be falling too. Okay? And it's an election year. Okay? Now that depends on whether you will understand what it is that I'm doing. Because I'm going to tell you, too bad, shit, who would have known? We thought it would be 5, turned out to be 7, but it's falling, okay? And you might believe me. And you might say, okay, we're going to do this for 5% inflation again. But once you see 7 once again, you're going to understand, okay, same old, same old. So now you're going to expect 7, I'm going to give you 9, we're going to be up to double digits very soon. Did you get this? Okay, now I'm going to ask you an important question. Isn't it very cool? This is a great toolkit to think about policy, Okay, so you're going to spend the entire next week going over this in detail with Burçin Hoca. I just gave you an overview of this, okay? But it's really important. And this is where, my friends, we say goodbye for the semester for the purpose of this course. So allow me to say a proper goodbye in a minute or so. It was a pleasure. And I am truly happy that we had half of the semester in class where I properly got to see you, got to know you, and like you for a reason that I could put my finger on before the pandemic hit and we all scattered to our homes. You all understand that, oh yeah, you know, lectures are lectures, it's all the same. It really isn't, okay? The human connection matters a lot. And I do value that we had the first half of the semester to form that connection. You are now people I know, people I like. You are now my people. And I would like to tell you this. You are, in different ways, special people, and in some ways lucky. And I'm not using this luck in a offhand manner, okay? You all work your asses off to be here. That's not luck. But the fact that you are people who are willing to work your asses off, you're lucky. Either you were brought up that way or you had the genes for it, neither of which you chose. It gives you some responsibility to make good use of that, okay? Do so. Here's the point. Those of you who are going to do Erasmus exchanges, and hopefully they're going to be back when the world is normal, you will understand this before you graduate. Toprağa öperek geri geldiğiniz zaman. You are at a special place. You all understand that you're getting a great education with incredible resources, whatnot, okay? But it is normal that you will have this nagging feeling at the end of the day, we're getting the best education available in Turkey. You know, here we are in Ankara, and that's the best available in the country, but it's the best here, okay? It really isn't. You will see that you're getting a world-class and world-class at the top class education with resources to go with that. And your human capital is second to none. That means you're capable of doing great things. That means it's incumbent on you that you do great. You are unhappy with the way this country is. You're unhappy with the way this world is. It's going to change if you change it. And you are the people to change it. And I really do count on you to do so. So get your asses up, do your thing. And do your thing isn't, you know, just study for your exams, whatever. Feel that it is you who is going to make a difference and make the difference. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you once we are back to our physical environment and I could give you all a hug and tell you that you are special people. I do love you. Be well. We'll be in touch. Goodbye.